talking about. And the details might get kind of graphic, so just letting you know before you watch this. Yeah. So, we'll start off with Lawrence Bittaker. He was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on September 27th, 1940. And he was the unwanted child of a couple who had chosen not to have children. He was placed in an orphanage by his birth mother and was adopted as an infant. Bittaker was first arrested for shoplifting at the age of 12 and obtained a minor criminal record over the next 4 years after further arrest for the same offense, in addition to petty theft, which brought him to the attention of juvenile authorities. Bittaker would later claim these numerous theft-related offenses committed throughout his adolescence had been attempts to compensate for the lack of love he received from his parents. Although reported to have an IQ of 138, Bittaker considered school to be a tedious experience and dropped out of high school in 1957. By this stage in his adolescence, he and his adoptive parents were living in California. Within a year of dropping out, he had been arrested for car theft, a hit and run, and evading arrest. For these offenses, he was imprisoned at the California Youth Authority, where he remained until he was 18 years old. Upon release, Bittaker discovered that his adoptive parents had disowned him and moved to another state. He would never see his adoptive parents again. Now, Roy Lewis Norris was born in Greeley, Colorado on February 5th, 1948. Norris was conceived out of wedlock. His parents had married to avoid the social stigma surrounding illegitimate birth at the time. His father worked in a scrapyard and his mother was a drug-addicted housewife. He occasionally lived with his parents throughout his childhood and adolescence, but was repeatedly placed in the care of foster families throughout the state of Colorado. Norris's childhood recollections were interspersed with memories of wrongful accusations while living with his biological parents, and of being neglected by many of the foster families he lived with, frequently being denied sufficient food or clothing. He also claimed to have been sexually abused when in the care of a Hispanic family, later stating the prejudice he held toward Hispanic people originated from the neglect and abuse he endured as a child when placed in the care of this family. While living with his birth parents at the age of 16, Norris visited the home of a female relative who was in her early 20s and began speaking to her in a sexually suggestive manner. She ordered him to leave her house and informed his father, who threatened to subject him to a beating. Norris subsequently stole his father's car and drove into the Rocky Mountains, where he attempted to commit suicide by injecting pure air into an artery in his arm. He was later apprehended as a runaway and returned to live with his parents. Upon his return home, Norris's parents informed him that he and his younger sister were unwanted children and that they intended to divorce when both reached adolescence. A year later, Norris dropped out of school and joined the United States Navy. He was stationed in San Diego in 1965 and was deployed to serve in the Vietnam War in 1969. Although he did not see active combat, he was honorably discharged from the Navy after one tour of duty. Now back to Bittaker. Within days of his parole from the California Youth Authority, Bittaker was arrested for transporting a stolen vehicle across state lines. In August 1959, Bittaker was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment to be served in Oklahoma. He was later transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Missouri to serve the remainder of his sentence. In 1960, Bittaker was released from prison and soon reverted to crime. Within months of his release, he was arrested again for robbery and was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. While incarcerated, he was characterized by a psychiatrist as being highly manipulative. He was released on parole in 1963 after completing 2 years of his sentence. In 1964, he was again imprisoned for parole violation. In 1966, he underwent further examinations by 2 independent psychiatrists, both of whom classified him as a borderline psychopath, a highly manipulative individual unable to acknowledge the consequences of his actions. Bittaker explained to one of them that his criminal activities gave him a feeling of self-importance. A year later, he was again released into society. After his parole in July 1967, he was again arrested and convicted of theft and of leaving the scene of an accident. He was sentenced to 5 years but was released in 1970. In March 1971, he was again arrested, and due to repeated parole violations, he was sentenced to serve between 6 months and 15 years imprisonment. 3 years later, he was released from prison. In 1974, Bittaker was arrested for assault with attempt to commit murder after he stabbed a young supermarket employee who had accused him of stealing. The supermarket employee had observed Bittaker stealing a steak and had followed him outside, where he asked Bittaker whether he had forgotten to pay. Bittaker responded by stabbing his pursuer in the chest, narrowly missing his heart. He attempted to flee but was quickly restrained by 2 other supermarket employees. The employee, Gary Louie, survived the stabbing, and Bittaker was convicted of the lesser charge of assault with a deadly weapon. Now back to Norris. In November 1969, Norris was arrested for his first known sexual offenses. He was charged with both rape and assault with intent to commit rape. In the latter incident, he had attempted to force his way into the car of a lone woman. 3 months later, February 1970, Norris attempted to deceive a lone woman into allowing him into her home. When the woman refused, he attempted to break into her house, and she phoned the police, who arrested Norris. Less than 3 months after this offense, Norris was diagnosed by the military psychologist with schizoid personality disorder. He was given an administrative discharge from the Navy under terms labeled as psychological problems. In May 1970, on bail for his latest offense, he attacked a female student who had been stalking the grounds of San Diego State University. He repeatedly struck her on the back of the head with a rock until she slumped to her knees. He repeatedly beat her head against the sidewalk as he knelt upon her lower back. Shortly thereafter, Norris was charged with assault with a deadly weapon. He was committed to 5 years imprisonment, where he was classified as a mentally disordered sex offender. He was released in 1975 with 5 years probation. Just 3 months after his release, he approached a 27-year-old woman walking home from a restaurant and offered her a ride on his bicycle. When she declined, he parked the bicycle and grabbed the woman's scarf, twisting it around her neck, before informing her he intended to rape her and dragging her into the nearby bushes. Fearing for her life, the woman did not resist. Although it was reported to the police, they were initially unable to find the perpetrator. However, 1 month later, the victim observed his motorcycle and noted the license number, which she immediately gave to the police. He was arrested for rape. 1 year later, he was tried and convicted for this offense. While incarcerated at California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, he met and befriended Bittaker. They gradually became more closely acquainted and began talking in friendly terms when Norris taught Bittaker how to construct jewelry. According to Norris, Bittaker saved him from being attacked by fellow inmates on at least 2 occasions. By 1978, the pair had become close acquaintances, discovering they shared an interest in sexual violence and misogyny. With Norris also divulging to Bittaker, the biggest stimulation for him was of seeing frightened young women. Adding this was the primary reason he had amassed a lengthy record for sexual offenses. Bittaker, who is not known to have committed any sexual offenses prior to his meeting Norris, himself divulged to Norris that if he ever raped a woman, he would kill her so as not to leave a witness to the crime. When alone, they regularly discussed plans to assault and murder teenage girls after they were released. This shared fantasy evolved into an elaborate plan to murder one girl of each teenage year, from 13 through 19. The pair vowed to become reacquainted once they were released. On January 15th, 1979, 3 months after Bittaker was released, Norris was also released from prison and moved into his mother's home. Within 1 month of his release, he had raped a woman who he then simply abandoned in the desert. He soon found employment as an electrician in Compton. Shortly thereafter, he received a letter from Bittaker. In late February, the pair met at a hotel and rekindled their plan. From February to June 1979, Bittaker and Norris picked up over 20 female hitchhikers. The pair did not assault these girls in any manner. These practice runs were merely a way for them to develop ruses to lure girls into the van voluntarily and of discovering secluded locations. In late April, the pair found an isolated fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains. Bittaker broke open the locked gate with a crowbar and replaced the lock with one that he owned. Bittaker and Norris killed their first victim, 16-year-old Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, on June 24th, 1979. She was last seen leaving a fellowship meeting at St. Andrew's Church in Redondo Beach. In his written accounts of the events of this day, Bittaker stated he and Norris first finished constructing the bed the pair had installed in the rear of the van, beneath which they placed tools, clothes, and a cooler filled with beer and soft drinks. At approximately 11 a.m., the pair drove to the beach area, drinking beer, smoking grass, and flirting with girls. At approximately 7:46 p.m., Norris spotted Schaefer walking down a side street toward her grandmother's home and remarked to Bittaker, "There's a cute little blonde." After unsuccessfully attempting to entice Schaefer into their van with alternative offers of marijuana and a lift home, Bittaker and Norris drove further ahead and parked alongside a driveway. Norris then exited the vehicle, opened the passenger side sliding door, and leaned into the van with his head and shoulders obscured from view. When Schaefer passed the van, Norris exchanged a few words with her before dragging her into the van and closing the door. Using a ruse they would repeat in most of their subsequent murders, Bittaker turned the radio to full volume as Norris bound the victim's arms and legs and gagged her with duct tape. As Bittaker drove Schaefer to the fire road in the mountains. Despite initially screaming when she was abducted, Schaefer quickly regained her composure. In his written account of the night that followed, Bittaker wrote that Schaefer displayed a magnificent state of self-control and composed acceptance of the conditions of which she had no control. She shed no tears, offered no resistance, and expressed no great concern for her safety. I guess she knew what was coming. At the fire road, Norris first raped Schaefer after instructing Bittaker to go take a walk and return in 1 hour. Schaefer's absence, Schaefer asked him whether they intended to kill her, to which Norris replied no. In response, Schaefer requested to be allowed time to pray before she was killed if that was Bittaker and Norris's intention. In their subsequent accounts of the actual murder, Bittaker and Norris gave differing accounts as to who argued over whether they should kill her rather than release her. Each stated the other argued that they should kill her. In any event, Schaefer pleaded for only a second to pray, before Norris attempted to manually strangle her. After approximately 45 seconds, he became disturbed at the look in her eyes and ran to the front of the van, vomiting. Bittaker then manually strangled Schaefer until she collapsed to the ground and began convulsing. He then twisted a wire coat hanger around her neck with vice grip pliers until Schaefer's convulsions ceased. Schaefer was denied her request to pray before Bittaker and Norris killed her. Her body was wrapped in a plastic shower curtain and thrown over a steep canyon Bittaker had selected. According to Norris, after Bittaker had thrown Schaefer over the canyon, Bittaker assured him the animals would eat her up so there wouldn't be any evidence left. On July 8th, 1979, 2 weeks after the murder of Schaefer, they encountered 18-year-old Andrea Joy Hall hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway. As the pair slowed the van to offer Hall a lift, another vehicle pulled over and offered the same thing, which she accepted. Bittaker and Norris followed the vehicle from a distance. On this occasion, Norris hid in the back of the van in order to dupe Hall into believing Bittaker was traveling alone. Inside the van, Bittaker offered Hall a cold drink from the cooler in the rear of the van. Norris, who had hidden behind a bedspread in the rear of the van, pounced on Hall when she attempted to retrieve the drink. After a strenuous fight, he managed to subdue her by twisting her arm behind her back, causing her to scream in pain. Norris then gagged Hall with adhesive tape and bound her wrists and ankles. They drove to the location in the mountains, beyond where they had earlier taken Schaefer. At this location, she was raped twice by Bittaker and once by Norris. While Bittaker was raping Hall for the second time, Norris saw what he believed to be vehicle headlights approaching. Bittaker clasped his hands over Hall's mouth and dragged her into nearby bushes as Norris drove in an unsuccessful search for the vehicle he thought he had seen. When he returned, the pair drove to a location farther in the mountains. Bittaker forced Hall to walk uphill naked alongside the road and to then perform oral sex on him before ordering Hall to pose for several Polaroid pictures. They drove to a third location where Bittaker again walked Hall up a nearby hill, this time as Norris drove to a nearby store to purchase alcohol. When Norris returned, Bittaker was alone and in the possession of 2 further Polaroid pictures he had taken, both of which depicted Hall's face and expressions Norris later described as being of sheer terror as she begged for her life to be spared. Bittaker informed Norris that he had told Hall he was going to kill her and challenged her to give him as many reasons as she could come up with as to why she should be allowed to live, before thrusting an ice pick through her ear into her brain. He then turned her body over and thrust the ice pick into her other ear, stomping on it until the handle broke. Bittaker then strangled Hall before throwing her body off a cliff. On September 3rd, Bittaker and Norris observed 2 girls named Jackie Doris Gilman and Jacqueline Lee Lamp sitting on a bus stop near Hermosa Beach. Lamp and Gilliam had been hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway before Bittaker and Norris observed them as they were resting at the bus stop. They offered the girls a ride, which they accepted. Inside the van, both girls were offered marijuana by Norris, which they accepted. Shortly after entering the van, both girls realized that Bidaker had steered the van off of the Pacific Coast Highway and was driving in the direction of the San Gabriel Mountains. When the girls protested, both Bidaker and Norris attempted to allay the girls' concerns with excuses, which did not deceive either girl. Lamp, aged 13, attempted to open the sliding door, whereupon Norris hit her on the back of the head with a bag filled with lead weights, briefly knocking her unconscious before overpowering 15-year-old Gilliam as he began to bind and gag Gilliam. Lamp regained consciousness and again attempted to flee the van, whereupon Norris twisted her arm behind her back and dragged her back into the van. As this struggle ensued, Bidaker, noting the girl's struggle was in full view of potential witnesses, stopped the van, punched Gilliam in the face, and assisted Norris in finished binding and gagging the two girls. The girls were driven to the mountains where they were held captive for almost 2 days, being bound and gagged between repeated instances of sexual and physical abuse. Both men slept in the van alongside their 2 hostages, with each alternately acting as a lookout. On one occasion, Bidaker walked Lamp onto a nearby hill and forced her to pose for pornographic pictures before returning to the van. Bidaker also asked Norris to take several Polaroid pictures of himself and Gillian, both nude and clothed. In the first of 3 instances in which Bidaker raped Gilliam, he also created a tape recording of himself raping her, forcing the girl to pretend she was his cousin and informing Gilliam to feel free to express her pain. Bidaker is also known to have tortured Gilliam by stabbing her breasts with an ice pick and using vice grip pliers to tear off part of her nipple. After almost 2 days of captivity, Lamp and Gilliam were murdered. At Bidaker's subsequent trial, Norris claimed he had suggested that Gilliam be killed quickly, as unlike Lamp, she had been largely cooperative through the period of her captivity, whereupon Bidaker replied, "No, they only die once anyway." Gilliam was struck in each ear with an ice pick and then strangled to death. After Bidaker had murdered Gilliam, he then forced Lamp out of the van. Upon exiting the sliding door, Bidaker shouted to her, "You wanted to stay a virgin, now you can die a virgin," before Norris struck her upon the head with a sledgehammer. Bidaker then strangled Lamp until he believed she had died. When Lamp opened her eyes, Norris again bludgeoned her repeatedly as Bidaker strangled her to death. The bodies of Gilliam and Lamp were thrown over an embankment in the chaparral. On October 31st, 1979, Bidaker and Norris abducted their final victim, 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford. She was abducted as she stood outside a gas station, hitchhiking home from a Halloween party in the Sunland, Tujunga suburb of Los Angeles. Investigators believe Ledford accepted a ride home from Bidaker and Norris because she recognized Bidaker, as he is known to have frequented the McDonald's restaurant in which she had a part-time job as a waitress. Upon accepting the offer of a lift home, she was offered marijuana, which she refused. Bidaker drove the van to a secluded street, where Norris drew a knife, then bound and gagged Ledford with construction tape. Bidaker then traded places with Norris, who drove in an aimless manner for in excess of an hour, as Bidaker remained with Ledford in the back. After removing the tape from the girl's mouth and legs, Bidaker tormented her, initially slapping and mocking her, then beating her with his fists as he repeatedly shouted for her to say something. Then, as Ledford began screaming, shouting for her to scream louder. As Ledford continued screaming, Bidaker began asking her as he struck her, "What's the matter? Don't you like to scream?" As Ledford began to cry, she pleaded with Bidaker, repeatedly saying, "No, don't touch me." In response, Bidaker again ordered her to scream as loud as she could, as she then began alternately striking her with a hammer. beating her breasts with his fists and torturing her with pliers, both between and throughout instances when he raped and sodomized her. Repeatedly, Ledford can be heard pleading for the abuse to cease and making statements such as, "Oh no, no," as sounds of Bittaker alternately extracting either the sledgehammer or the pliers from the toolbox can be heard on a tape recording he made after entering the rear of the van. Norris later described hearing screams, constant screams, emanating from the rear of the van as he drove. Shortly after Norris switched places with Bittaker, he himself switched on the tape recorder that Bittaker had used to record much of the time he had been in the rear of the van with Ledford. Norris first shouted for Ledford to go ahead and scream, or I'll make you scream. In response, Ledford pleaded, "I'll scream if you stop hitting me," then emitted several high-pitched screams as Norris encouraged her to continue until he ordered her to stop. Norris then reached for the sledgehammer as Ledford, seeing him do this, screamed, "Oh no." Norris then struck Ledford once upon the left elbow in response. She informed Norris he had broken her elbow before pleading, "Don't hit me again." In response, he raised the sledgehammer as Ledford repeatedly screamed, "No." Norris then proceeded to strike Ledford 25 times upon the same elbow with the sledgehammer, before asking her, "What are you sniveling about?" as Ledford continuously screamed and wept. After approximately 2 hours of captivity, Norris killed Ledford by strangling her with a wire coat hanger, which he tightened with pliers. Ledford did not react much to the act of strangulation, although she died with her eyes open. Bittaker opted to discard her body on a random lawn in order to view the reaction from the press. The pair drove to a randomly selected house in Sunland, where Norris discarded Ledford's body in a bed of ivy upon the front lawn. Her body was found the following morning by a jogger. An autopsy revealed that in addition to having been sexually assaulted, she had died of strangulation after receiving extensive blunt force trauma to the face, head, breasts, and left elbow, with her olecranon sustaining multiple fractures, which I assume is the elbow bone. Her genitalia and rectum had been torn, caused in part by Bittaker having inserted pliers into her body. In addition, her left hand bore a puncture wound, and a finger on her right hand had been slashed. Bittaker would later claim the tape recording the pair had created of Ledford's clear abuse and torture offered nothing other than the evidence of a threesome, adding that toward the very end, Ledford was screaming for him and Norris to kill her. In November of 1979, Norris became reacquainted with a friend named Joseph Jackson. Norris confided in Jackson regarding his and Bittaker's exploits over the previous 5 months, including graphic details of the murder of Shirley Ledford. Norris also divulged to Jackson that in addition to the 5 murders he and Bittaker had committed, there had been 3 additional incidents in which he and Bittaker had abducted or attempted to abduct young women who had either escaped their attackers or in one instance had actually been raped but released. Upon hearing Norris's confessions, Jackson consulted his attorney, who advised him to inform authorities. He agreed, and he and his attorney informed the Los Angeles Police Department, who in turn relayed the 2 men to the Hermosa Beach Police. Paul Binham was assigned to investigate Jackson's claims. Binham initially noted that Jackson's statements as to Norris's confessions did match reports on file as several teenage girls who had been reported missing over the previous 5 months. In addition, the incident Norris had confided to Jackson where he claimed he and Bittaker had sprayed mace in the face of a woman who had been dragged into the van and raped by both men matched a report filed in relation to an incident that occurred on September 30th. In this filed report, a young woman named Robin Robeck had been sprayed in her face with mace before being dragged into a van, raped by 2 Caucasian men in their mid-30s, Although she reported it to the police, they had been unable to identify her attackers. An investigator was dispatched to Robeck's residence to show her a series of mugshots. Without hesitation, she identified 2 photos presented to her as her rapist. The 2 individuals were Bittaker and Norris. On November 20th, 1979, Norris was arrested by the Hermosa Beach police for parole violation. The same day at the Burbank motel where he resided, Bittaker was arrested for the rape of Robin Robeck. Although Robeck had identified mugshots of Bittaker and Norris, she was unable to positively identify her assailants in a police lineup. Nonetheless, police had observed Norris dealing in marijuana, whereas Bittaker had been in possession of drugs at the time of arrest, so both were held on charges of parole violation. A search of Bittaker's apartment revealed several Polaroid photographs which were determined as depicting Hall and Gilliam, both of whom had been reported as missing earlier the same year. Inside Bittaker's van, investigators discovered a sledgehammer, a plastic bag filled with lead weights, a book detailing how to locate police radio frequencies, a jar of Vaseline, 2 necklaces later confirmed as belonging to 2 of the victims, and a tape recording of a young woman in obvious distress, screaming and repeatedly pleading for mercy while being tortured and sexually abused. The mother of Ledford, named by Jackson as being one of the girls whom Norris had confessed he and Bittaker had killed, identified the voice on the tape as being that of her only daughter. The voices of the 2 men mocking and threatening Ledford in the process of her torture and abuse were identified as being Roy Norris and Lawrence Bittaker. Inside Norris's apartment, police discovered a bracelet he had taken from Ledford's body as a souvenir. Also found at the homes of both Bittaker and Norris were Polaroid pictures of almost 500 teenage girls and young women, most of which had apparently been taken at Redondo Beach and at Hermosa Beach, with others taken by Bittaker at a Burbank high school. Most of these pictures had been taken without the girls' knowledge or consent. On November 30th, 1979, Norris initially denied any involvement in the murders, rapes, or disappearances. However, when confronted with the evidence the investigators had compiled, Norris began to confess, although he did attempt to portray Bittaker as being more culpable in the murders than himself. According to Norris, the level of brutality Bittaker had exhibited toward their victims had increased on each successive instance they had lured a girl into the van. Their final victim, Ledford, had actually pleaded to be killed in order for her agony to end. Norris agreed to return to the San Gabriel Mountains to search for the bodies of the girls to whose abduction and murder he had confessed to assisting in. In each instance, Norris brought detectives to the area where he and Bittaker had disposed of their victims' bodies. Despite extensive searches of the areas where he stated the bodies of Schaefer and Hall had been discarded, their bodies were never found. On February 9th, 1980, the skeletonized bodies of Lamp and Gilliam were found at the bottom of a canyon alongside a dry riverbed. The bodies were scattered over an area measuring hundreds of feet in diameter. An ice pick was still lodged in the skull of Gilliam. The skull of Lamp bore multiple indentations, evidence of the numerous hammer blows Norris had stated he inflicted. In February of 1980, Norris and Bittaker were formally charged with the murders of the 5 girls. At the arraignment, Bittaker was denied bail, whereas Norris's bail was set at $10,000. Within 1 month of being charged with murder, Norris had accepted a plea bargain in which he would testify against Bittaker in return for the prosecution agreeing not to seek the death penalty against him. On February 17th, 1981, after deliberating for 3 days, the jury found Bittaker guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, 5 charges of kidnapping, 9 charges of rape, 2 charges of forcible oral copulation, 1 charge of sodomy, and 3 charges of unlawful possession decisions as to whether Bittaker should be sentenced to death or life without parole began February 19th. The jury deliberated for just 90 minutes before they returned with their verdict. Bittaker was sentenced to death for the 5 counts of first-degree murder upon which the prosecution had sought this penalty. And that is the end of this case, you guys. This was a really hard one. I don't really read or research these too much before actually doing these videos, so it's all like news to me as I'm reading it, and I was not expecting it to be as graphic as it was. So I don't know, that was, yeah. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you would like, and I will see you in my next video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye, you guys.